have a truly global audience today, joining from as far as Brazil, Thailand, and Kuwait. So it's really good to see. And yeah, while COVID-19 is forcing us to go virtual, it also offers opportunities by evading borders that we otherwise would have to respect when having face-to-face meetings. So thanks for joining. My name is Karin de Borst. I'm chairing the EAGE Special Interest Community on Decarbonization and Energy Transition. And I'm going to be your host tonight and going to guide you through this meeting. Please note this session is being recorded. We're going to make the recordings available probably through the EAGE YouTube channel, and we're also going to share them on the LinkedIn groups of the organizing EAGE communities. EAGE, the energy transition is definitely a topic of big concerns for most of the geoscientists. It brings uncertainty about future job opportunities. It's not yet clear which role geoscience will play in delivering the energy transition and which of our skills will be required to unlock the full potential of the subsurface for energy production. In the end, it boils down to, does the energy transition present a threat or an opportunity for geoscientists? It will not be possible to provide an answer to all these questions in our webcast tonight, and probably there is not something like a clear answer to that. It's a very individual question, and it would have to be answered against the personal interests and capabilities of everybody. But we hope that we can provide some perspectives on this topic, integrating even views from social science and artificial intelligence. And we hope that it may help for each individual person to map out potential future paths and to actively steer one's career through the challenges to come. Before now diving into the technical presentations, let me take a moment to introduce EAGE and the organizing communities. Probably don't have to say much about, how can I advance the slides? Yes, that's it. Say much about EAGE, because many of you know it or are even members of it. So EAGE, the European Association of Geoscientists and Engineers, also acting worldwide, but still half the members being located in Europe. Its main activities are events, educational programs, publications, but one of its main aims is also to establish a connection with its members and to stimulate networking among its members. And key to achieving this aim are local or thematic subgroups, which are called local chapters and special interest communities. And today's event is a joint effort of two local chapters, namely the local chapter Paris and the local chapter Netherlands, and one special interest community, the special interest and community on decarbonization and the energy transition. All communities live from their members. So if you're interested in learning more about our activities or potentially joining these communities, here you find contact details. You can follow us on LinkedIn or directly approach it through the email addresses that are specified on this slide. The e-afterwork today is already the second in a series of joint events between the local chapter Paris and the DET community, DET being short for decarbonization and the energy transition. So we started back in March with a general introductory session highlighting several aspects of the energy transition, starting off with basic questions as, is the climate changing and is this important? To sharing how particularly France is approaching the energy transition from a technical perspective, but also from societal and governmental directions. This event was still planned as a face-to-face event, but as we all know, COVID-19 started to spread and forced us to go virtual. And we fully embraced the opportunities, as I mentioned in the beginning, of not having to respect regional borders anymore, and also took the local chapter Netherlands on board which finally resulted in this after work that you're currently listening to. We still plan part 2, obviously, of the series on talents and competences in the energy sector. We're still working on a date for that, but expect it to happen in the second half of June. And in this event, we want to shed light on what the energy transition means for geoscience education, particularly academic education. And our two speakers, Timo Heimovara from TU Delft and Ian Stewart from University of Plymouth, will share their views, their experiences, and will lead a hopefully very interactive discussion to hear also views from everyone out there about how revised curricula could or should look like. Just stay tuned on LinkedIn. We are going to publish the date and also the link for the registration there in a short time. Before now moving on to the technical presentations, still advertise to more events in the energy transition space that are coming up. Already in about 2 weeks' time, there's another webcast, this time in the early afternoon on June 10. And in this webcast, which is also organized by the DET community, we are not looking in the future, but in the present, and we will showcase existing actions to reduce the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint of the energy business. And the special focus will be placed on projects and the intersection of traditional and future energies. And you will also see contributions not only from Europe, but also from other continents. So stay tuned for that, as well as for the first Geoscience and Engineering in the Energy Transition Conference. That's now looking a bit further in the future. This event is going to happen in November in Strasbourg, everything being well. It's a interdisciplinary conference, as you see, integrating topics related to different subsurface uses of the subsurface in the energy transition. The call for abstracts is open at the moment. You still have time until June 28 to submit your abstracts and to be part of this inaugural event, which we hope to develop into a recurrent event on the energy transition agenda. That's it with advertisements. Now, some ground rules for this conference call. We would ask all participants to be muted and also to switch off the video so that we don't strain the network. If you have questions, please share them in the chat box and send them to everybody. Some of you have already used it to indicate their location, so you have already found that you get this ribbon here when you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, and here then at this symbol you get the chat box. We will collect questions during the calls, during the presentations, excuse me, and will then bring up in direct Q&As after each presentation, and we will have a general discussion at the end where remaining questions can be taken up, or where we can also seek responses to the same questions from all the speakers we have in today's call. Yeah, now the agenda for today, we have 3 presentations by Max Brouwers, Lucia Levato, and John Midgley. First, Max is going to share some conclusions and insights gained from the last AAPG Energy Transition Forum, which took place last fall in Edinburgh. And under the title, A New Area for Geoscientists, they collected views of professionals, academics, and students on the future of the geosciences in a newly shaped energy landscape. So exploring pretty much similar questions that we are doing today. This will be followed by a presentation by Lousier, who recently kicked off a research project in which he uses artificial intelligence to try to find out what the skills are that will be required. And in the first step, that's what you're going to talk about today, what actually the strategies are that the energy companies are embarking on at the moment. And last but not least, we have John providing us with an integration of views as a geoscientist and as a social scientist to explore what role the society plays in the energy transition. This brings me to the introduction of Max. He's the chairman of the AAPG Energy Transition Forum. He holds a degree in geology from University of Utrecht and then deepened his management skills in Rotterdam, got an MBA from Rotterdam School of Management. He joined Shell 24 years ago and held different positions from exploration to commercial roles. His current position is Vice President for Exploration Europe, Russia and Caspian. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Max. Thanks for joining, and I hand over to you.
Karin, thanks very much for the kind introduction. I need to triple task now a little bit, so give me a moment maybe to bring the slides up, if that works for you guys.
Take your time.
Get going. Hopefully you can see them now there. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I think it's great that the EAGE and the AAPG are actually collaborating in this area, which has a lot of common interests. And I'm very happy to share today with you the findings and the outcome of the Energy Transition Forum, which we held in Edinburgh last year. I'm presenting here as the chair of that forum, so not in my role which I have as Shell. I'll be presenting a variety of views which were shared at that particular forum by the speakers. So these are not necessarily all my views, but I hope still to represent the various views as good as I can. I think the first question which one may ask is actually, why should we actually be bothered about this conversation? Is it really helping us? Do we actually get a better feel of what the energy transition is? And actually at the event, we did a little poll to get an assessment how people felt before and after the event. And you can see with the graph on the left-hand side that the majority of the views were not so sure about if there is really a good future for geoscientists as part of the energy transition. And at the end, same group of people polled again, and the view was much more optimistic. I'm not sure because they're glad that the 2 days were over, that gave them a good mood, but I do think it was really because they have a better appreciation that there is actually a lot to be done for geoscientists, actually many more roles than there might be in the past. There will be a wider variety. Some roles will decrease, other roles will actually develop, and some of them actually we will find very hard even to predict nowadays what they will be. But let me actually then start off with a little bit of a broader picture. I think it's important when we talk about the energy transition, which by its own is already a huge topic, that it is actually something of which is even larger, and how do we actually make sure that we actually have a sustainable future for our planet. And that goes beyond, as I say, the energy transition. The United Nations, as many of you will be aware, actually has outlined 17 areas in which actually we should be focusing. These sustainability development goals, you see 3 of them highlighted here. And they actually are a call to action for all countries to promote prosperity while at the same time protecting the planet. And clearly energy transition fits within that. But I think it's important to realize that, because sometimes the discussion becomes very black and white. Yes, we need to invest immediately all in energy transition because that's going to save the planet. And that by its own might be a very noble cause to pursue. But there are other things which we need to take care of as well, which includes making sure that people actually also have the energy security which they're looking for. And that is not easy. And I think there are various nuances, and many of them we might not always get the subtlety of. But one particular presentation which I really liked, which helped to highlight that subtlety, was actually a presentation given by Jeremy Woods, or more specifically, he shared a tool with us, which actually allows to play with many different kind of factors, 40 different kind of levers on how, if any of us were able to rule the world as a dictator, where we could say, okay, population, you should be more doing of this or do less of that. You can actually start seeing how that actually would impact the population in many different kind of ways. So you see at the bottom of the slide, many tweaks you can start playing with and see what that actually does for the temperature which we have, CO2 emissions, and a variety of other factors. And one of the factors which I found quite interesting is the amount of impact actually we have on the food which we choose. And I think that's a topic which is coming up quite a bit these days. If we were, for example, all to become vegetarians and we're all to eat local products close from where we actually live, we could have an even bigger impact than some of the most aggressive scenarios where we switch from fossil fuels to new energies. And again, it's not that I want to proclaim that we therefore shouldn't do the latter, but it is important to keep in mind that there are many different levers which we should consider, and many different levers which we also need to play with, but many of them actually also have downsides. So again, it is a delicate balance. But let me actually then move one step further and start talking a little bit more about the energy transition itself. What you see here is a slide actually from the Shell scenario work. Scenarios are not projections of predictions of what the future will hold, but they are potential outcomes, potential pathways to get to a certain kind of outcome. Shell previously created two scenarios called mountain and oceans. They had some difficulties in actually achieving the 2 degree or less than 2 degree temperature, global temperature increase. But they developed a third scenario called Sky, which outlines a potential pathway of actually getting there. But it is pretty challenging for the whole world. It is a really optimistic kind of view of what the world all should be doing in order to get to this particular point. So going in a little bit more detail on that one, that Sky scenario, in order to achieve then the less than 2 degrees heating, really requires a major change in the energy usage, the end user usage through electrification. And you see that around, okay, maybe by the end of this century, more than 50% of all our activity should by that time be electrified, which is a pretty tall order. But what you see in this scenario as well is that even in this, if you like, more optimistic scenario, a scenario in order for us to actually achieve less than 2 degrees heating, there's still quite a lot of fossil fuels being used. And these are quite often liquid and gas fossil fuels used in harder to electrify areas or sectors, if you like. But even within those, you can start seeing that for the liquid fuels, you see that oil remains important for quite some time, but biofuels are expected to come up in this particular scenario. And in the more gaseous fuels, you see that natural gas will be a key contributor and be so for quite some time, but hydrogen is expected to take that place over time. And again, coal, which is currently the key source actually of electricity around the world, will in the long term only be used for its chemistry purposes. And I think on the biomass bit, the last bit, you see a way also move away from peat and dung and wood into commercial biomass, which is thereby more sustainable. So quite some changes required in order to get here. But I would say, actually, if you start looking at what it all takes in order to deliver then this optimistic scenario of the future, that there is quite a lot of and required. In order for us to achieve this, it is not sufficient to only electrify. It's not sufficient to even at the fastest reasonable pace change to renewables, but we also need to really continue to drive on energy efficiency in order to make sure that only the lowest carbon emitting remaining hydrocarbon projects are continued. We need to make sure we move forward with the global carbon pricing. We need to continue to work on CCS, and we actually need to stop deforestation. All those factors in the end are required for us to get to that less than 2 degrees picture. And that is a pretty tall order. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but we really need to see an uptake in various of these kind of areas more than what we're actually seeing at this moment in time, which, as it says at the bottom of the slide as well, really needs a change also of the mindset of people on what they're willing and not willing to consume. And again, another example which you gave earlier links also to the kind of food, for example, which we use. Let me move one step further, and actually I wanted to share with you now a slide actually which was presented by Wood Mackenzie, which again looks at scenarios and looks at their prediction of how over time, and this time going out to 2040, the fuel mix will look like in their view. And they have 2 different kind of models here, which they're sharing. That is their first model, slightly more, if you like, conservative, and then they have a slightly faster model. And to the right, actually, you see also a model from the International Energy Association, which is their most aggressive sustainable development scenario. And also in these 3 models, you see that hydrocarbons, oil and gas, the gray and the white, consist for a very large percentage, 50% or more of these models, which means that there are quite some jobs still required in order to produce these hydrocarbons. And I think if you were to look further, and we had previous presentations and earlier events, also if you look at the consultancy company of McKinsey and others, nearly all models show that at least until 2050, there's a significant amount of hydrocarbons still required in order to produce the energy for the growing population and the needs which this increasingly wealthy population has to satisfy their energy needs. So that might be interesting, but it might also raise the question, well, okay, that's oil, all the oil and gas which still needs to be produced. Do we still need to look for any new hydrocarbon sources? Do we need to still look for new oil and gas? And that's actually building then on this following slide. And what that actually does, and I'll try to explain, it's a slightly complicated one. You see the white dots and a green line and an orange line. Those are the 2 more aggressive models from what you saw on the previous slide. So the EIA Sustainable Development is how much hydrocarbons they predict are required up to 2040, and then above it in the green line is the amount of Wood Mackenzie's projected carbon constraint hydrocarbon requirement. And below that in the solid colors is the amount of oil and gas which in the different kind of categories, from what's currently on stream to what still needs to be found, and what is if you like in between. And what you see in these models, that's so that again, remember Wood Mackenzie is one of their more aggressive kind of models, shows that in that model a relatively modest amount of exploration would be required to really fill the growth compared to what we already have. Because most of it can actually be satisfied what already has been discovered. But in many cases, these kind of projects are currently not commercially very attractive, or they are challenged in one way or the other. So what I expect, especially on the front end of the upstream bit, that exploration will be significantly shifting to enhancing the portfolios. And that portfolio might be for commercial reasons, but it might also be to find hydrocarbons with maybe a lower CO2 footprint in order to produce. So EOR might be part of, if you like, the lower kind of wedges in here, maybe even on stream, but that might not be as attractive as developing something with a lower greenhouse gas emission. So that is where I see quite a lot of the remaining exploration effort required. Clearly, with regards to production geoscience, in order to fill all those other wedges, a lot of geoscience is still required in these. And to further maybe belabor a little bit that point on what will the focus be, I think the shift, and again here using a slide from Equinor, is away from the past where maybe explorers went out for it and just found oil or gas and handed it over to the development colleagues and said, okay, it's your problem, now you try to make money out of it. It will be much more targeted exploration, something which maybe is happening already in some bases around the world, but it really will be trying to predict in even more detail than I've been able to do before on some of the elements which you see here, which some of them are economic related, other ones are more environmentally related. How do we actually make sure that we have the hydrocarbons which are still attractive to be produced in the current environment, and attractive then again from commercial as well as environmental reasons. So I think that is, if you like, a little bit on the historic context of or the traditional hydrocarbon exploration. Let's maybe look a little bit further forward on CCS. And again, borrowing here a slide from professor from University of Stavanger. I appreciate it's a little bit wordy, but I really like what he did here because, by looking at it pretty objectively. So on the right-hand side, on the right-hand side in gray are a few generic kind of statements of why carbon capture and storage is something to really discuss. What he does then in the green and the yellow and the red is actually describing the pros and the cons of it. And I think it's fair to say that the world is indeed somewhat split in how good a solution CCS actually is. Some people maybe see it in the panacea. It allows us to find or to produce existing energy sources and do so with a very low no environmental footprint if we can indeed successfully store it all. But at the same time, there are some downsides to it as well. It is not necessarily cheap. There are uncertainties with regards to the storage, and have we actually are we in a state to actually roll it out quickly enough at this moment in time? And again, there's a balance on both sides. And I think that's what you see playing out as well in quite a lot of government policy setting, that there is not a clear hard push for CCS, maybe as much as some of us would like to see it, because of the type of trade-offs which are here. But I think there are a few arguments to highlight why, in the end, if you even look at this fair balance, why CCS is something which we should progress. And again, maybe linking back to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, we want to progress as a society, and we need energy for that, and we need energy with zero emissions. So in order to do that, the energy source which you currently have in abundance is actually fossil fuel, and CCS can really help us with that. And in certain cases, it is actually not that difficult if we apply it at the right kind of places, rather than maybe trying to extract it from the source. If we really can align it with certain production processes in refineries, immediately capture it from there, it can be done pretty cost effective. And I think in certain cases it can also be aligned pretty well with renewable energy projects. And it doesn't necessarily need to be an either or. As you saw on one of the earlier slides on the Shell scenarios, how much more energy the world needs. It is not a question, okay, one trades versus the other. we likely need all different kind of energy sources the world can bring us in order to meet the needs. But if we then look a little bit further and actually look at how well are we actually doing with progressing CCS, that's what you see actually on this slide. It shows indeed an increasing amount of CO2 captured, or the capacity at least for it. But in order to get where we need to be, and you see here that we have a capacity of what is it, 40 MTPA, we actually need much more than that. We actually need to get, for Europe alone, around 400 MMTPA of CO2 stored by 2040. So we still need to really ramp up in order to fill this gap. Sure, there might be other ways of potentially capturing that well, but in most cases, CCS is really the only viable way in order to store or ensure we have less CO2 emission in the near term. As I said, the 400 MMPTA by 2050 is a lot, and CCS is likely going to be one of the few truly viable solutions which we have for this. So I think the generic kind of view is, despite all the challenges which we see with CCS and it requiring government support, it is likely something which still is going to move forward in the years to come. I would like to make again a jump, and again, because I'm presenting various kind of presentations and I want to give all a little bit of attention in this talk. And so it's condensed of 2 days in a bit more than 20 minutes, is talk at least about, in one slide, about mining, because there is also, with the increased population, the increased wealth, which they have an increased desire for, let's call it, possessions, and therefore there's also big uptake, as you can see on the right hand graph. And by all honesty, this was a slide or a picture which came out after the event, but I thought it was very insightful to help depict how much more of a variety of rare earth elements we actually need to start mining in order to satisfy that need. So although maybe not a great employer of geoscientists, at least in Northwest Europe, where most of you are coming from, this is an area where we actually will see increased demand, and that might provide job opportunities for us in the future as well. And I would like next to move to with 2 slides and talk a little bit about, or 3 slides, talk a little bit more about data. This was actually a slide presented by the UK Oil and Gas Authority, if you like, the regulator in the UK. And they've been taking a pretty proactive stance on trying to get value out of the data which they have. And they see their role as really ensuring that the resources in the UK are being maximized for economic recovery. And in order to do so, they provide a lot of the data actually now in the cloud. You see some of the metrics here, and I think it's a real good example of actually a government taking a leading role in that and allowing a lot of nearly anybody at virtually no cost to access that data and actually use it to find new hydrocarbons which might have been overlooked in the past. And I think that shows again with the amount of data which we have here and which is now being made available and which will be followed and is already being followed by various other governments around the world, that the shift to much more data-driven, if you like, digital, is a change which we will see further grow because of the technologies which you have, as well as the availability of data like this one. One thing to share with you as well is actually, in order to help us move forward on the digital journey, a project has been started which involves by now more than 100 different companies who subscribe to it, which tries to provide, if you like, a standard for the use of data in subsurface. This is the called OSDU, or Open Subsurface Data Universe, where in the past, as a user, you needed to go to many kind of databases. They were all not connected. There was no way of actually accessing the data in a simple kind of manner. The idea is here that you, in the cloud, store all the data, or whoever wants to store the data there, in the same kind of manner. The key point here is that that data can be set to be accessible or not accessible, who you like. But the fact that it is all stored in the same manner allows for anybody who would like to start actually building tools on top of it. So effectively, if you think about your iPhone, the Apple provided the same kind of way in which all its machines run, and you can go to the iStore and get an app which built by either Apple or maybe somebody else, completely independent, and you can do with data which you would like. This is a little bit the same kind of idea. By setting that standards, we will allow many more developments to be done, because there's a much larger market, and that actually might further speed up the digitalization. And again, tools can be developed within a company, and they can hold them proprietary, or they can market them to many other people. And again, that could be big companies, it could be small companies, but I think that's a pretty exciting development. And if you want to see more, I would say just look for Open SDU or Open Subsurface Data Universe on the web, and you actually see some movies of YouTube, which what already is being done in this area. And the fact that so many companies have subscribed to it, in even the big ones like Schlumberger and many of the big IOCs as well, helps to highlight that this is likely going to be the standard for subsurface data. Then maybe a question which sometimes comes up is, well, that's all nice and good, all that digital, is that going to take away our job as geoscientists, because artificial intelligence will actually come out with the right calculation and what prospect to drill, or whatever kind of parameter you want to look at. And I think this slide, again from Wood Mackenzie, is nice, that they let a large database from onshore US run completely unconstrained and look at optimizing the parameters. So what are the most important parameters in order to see if a well is actually going to be a successful well, or a mediocre, or a poor well. On the left hand side, you see actually the result, what the machine came up if it was not given any constraints. And then actually things like the month in which it was actually drilled, or the latitude, or some other areas where you say, that not necessarily makes a lot of geological sense, came up. While if you applied some geological overlay on it, you got completely different kind of results of it. So I do believe that with all that data, it opens a wealth of opportunities for us as geoscientists to discover things which you haven't discovered yet. But the machine needs guidance, it needs understanding, it needs help, it needs interpretation. So I do actually see a shift in how we use data, but without a reduction for our roles, albeit a different roles, that being much more digital will certainly help us a lot. And that effectively brings me also to my last slide, which I wanted to share with you with some high-level generic observations. I think what we saw in the various presentations with the various models, that oil and gas will remain relevant for many decades to come. Its role in the overall energy mix clearly will decrease, but there are certain places where oil and gas still will be very required. At the same time, new energy sources are very much required. It is an and equation rather than an or equation. And some of them require quite a lot of geoscience as well, geothermal being a clear example. But also in the more, let's call it, newer activities, such as CCS, there will be clear roles for us, as well as in mining, there's also a potential uptake for roles for geoscientists. So all in all, I think there will be a much more diverse set of opportunities for us as geoscientists to work from. And that requires us still very much to have a very solid geoscience basis. Even if you want to go very much into the digit space, you need to understand the results. You need to guide the machine. But at the same time, making sure that you become digital literate, I think makes a lot of sense in order, again, to have a broader skill set. And in general, given the more fluidity of the energy types which the world is going to use, I think it makes sense to continue to invest in so-called transferable skills, i.e. skills which are useful in different kind of areas. And again, geoscience usually very good in dealing with uncertainties, in probabilistics, in nearly all these kind of energy supply areas. These are skills which are very, very helpful and provide likely good career opportunities. So with that, let me actually pause. I'm not sure exactly how I'm doing for time, hopefully still okay, and hand it back to you, Karin.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. Well timed, and thanks for this interesting journey across different roles that the geoscientists may play in the future or will play in the future. I think for some it's pretty clear already. We received some questions, and I may keep some of the questions for the general discussion, because I think that it could be interesting to have the input of all of the speakers. Some are more specific to what you shared. So one is on CCS. You have shown some of the hurdles, but it seems these kinds of projects are indeed needed, and there is a future here. Apart from geosciences, what other subsurface disciplines you think are key? Have the oil and gas companies the right skills?
Great question. I think the answer is yes and no. I think if you talk about subsurface skill in a slightly broader kind of sense, there's of course a lot of drilling activity which is still required in this, which requires input from geoscientists as well as normal predictions of reservoir quality, porosity, permeability. But skills which we maybe haven't developed that much yet relate to geochemistry. What's actually the impact of storing CO2 for a long time under a seal? Will that seal react with CO2? Do we really know that well enough? Or when it is an abandoned field with a lot of holes on it already drilled, how confident are we actually that there will not be, maybe not in the borehole itself, but around it, effects in the subsurface? So where in the past so far for traditional hydrocarbon exploration, we're just looking, can it be here, right now? We need to develop the skill. Will it be there also still for decades or centuries to come? And that requires quite a different way of thinking, which I'm sure we can further develop, but I don't think we have developed that sufficiently yet.
Thank you, Max. CCS triggers a lot of interest. We have another question related to CCS. Max, in your slides, you're promoting the increase of the use of CCS, but this is being tried to push since the first IPCC report. What is, in your opinion, the reason for the slow uptake of this technique, and why has it not been implemented more widely in the last 30 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the most fundamental underlying element is that we don't have a global carbon price yet. It is not expensive enough for people to, or society as a whole, to produce hydrocarbons at this moment in time with CO2 emissions. Only when that price of CO2 is so high that people will not want to pay the tax or whatever kind of system you want to put in place for it, CCS projects on their own will be commercially viable. And as long as they're not viable, business-oriented companies, simply given the way they're set up, they're all for-profit companies, will not invest. And I think what we also haven't seen is yet that the impetus, the push from governments to provide sponsorship for this in most places is also not sufficient in order to overcome that cost hurdle. But at the same time, I think society is clearly shifting. We see increase in every possible direction, that the concerns about climate change are increasing. Governments are pushed much more to act on that. So I do have hope, and I use that word carefully, I do have hope that things will change for the better. An underlying question, which I find very interesting, but don't have the answer to, is what's actually the current COVID and subsequent economic crisis going to do? Does that provide actually an opportunity for governments to invest more to stimulate their economies by actually putting a lot of capital into renewables, CCS, and these kind of things, and thereby accelerate the energy transition? Or are they so cash strapped already, so debt laden, that actually any of the initiatives which they have had will actually be curtailed, and in order to stimulate the economy, the cheapest energy source, whatever that might be, is being supported? And I think the arguments for both, and time will tell what that's going to do, including for CCS.
Yeah, you have anticipated another question, because we received indeed the question, what will COVID do to all that? And as a brief follow-up to what you just elaborated on as the blockers to CCS, I have the question, do you think CCS will be viable even if a carbon price is not implemented by government or no other funding schemes, so purely driven by industry?
Potentially, and then, again, it depends a little bit on societal requirements, and that might be in the end more of a driver in certain cases, that people say, I don't want to fuel up my tank, I don't want to heat my house with gas unless it is net zero emissions. And in order to do that, to meet those customer needs, and customers actually asking for these kind of products, then you might create a demand which stimulates companies to start investing in CCS even without a harder carbon price there. So the more society is going on that journey, the higher the demand of the cleanness of the energy source, even including the electricity which they use, is, the higher the probability is. But again, that's the question. If we then go into a recession now due to COVID, what are people going to do with the more limited money they have? Are they still going to ask and pay a premium for cleaner energy products? Or are they saying, sorry, I just need to get and drive around and so on, and I accept therefore more negative impact on the climate? An open question.
Indeed. And do you think, to let on myself now, I mean, next to the economics of CCS, also societal acceptance is still a blocker. And do you think that societal acceptance will shift together with increasing environmental concerns? And perhaps related to that, and connecting it now to our theme of geoscience skills, I mean, CCS is being done successfully. I'm looking at the Sleipner field since tens of years. And in principle, I think we have the technology to monitor what happens with the CO2 and to trigger control measures if we see that anything is not going as planned, and so that we don't risk the containment of the injected CO2. So it seems from a geoscience point of view, technically we are ready, but society is not. Do you think that geoscientists have failed to communicate what they can do, what they have done, or did they also not get the opportunity to be involved in these discussions?
A super question. I think the question in part, I would say, indeed answers itself. That society is not comfortable yet in many parts with CCS. We've seen it actually, and some of you actually living in the Netherlands will know it better, in Barendrecht, onshore the Netherlands, where they were planning to store CCS, and people said, no, I don't want CCS or CO2 stored in my back garden. There's more acceptance for it being offshore. Very nice, the FID recently taken by Shell, Equinor, Total, and sorry, I forget other companies, in the Northern Lights kind of project, and there it clearly is a really nice pilot project which has societal expectations. So on the other part of your question, yeah, I think the dialogue is not as open in the public as it is, and I think we need more open discussion on how comfortable are we really with CCS being a viable storage, and what if it starts to leak? What would happen then? And are there secondary reservoirs where it would sneak into, or is there geochemical reactions which you expect over time? And I think we need to find a way of communicating what easily can become a super technical and for us geoscientists, very enjoyable type of discussion to the layman on the street and make it simple. And even more so, I would say, inform politicians so the right kind of choices are being made in that area.
Yeah. I'm sorry that I have to cut the discussion now. We had still got another question in about CCS, but I think it's time to move on to the next presenter. I will take over again from you, Max.
Yeah, I think I stopped sharing my slides.
Yes, yeah. And you are sharing, that should be fine. That brings us to the second presentation by Lucia. Lucia is the founder and heart, I would say, of LUSVAL, a coaching company which is focusing on organizational innovation, mentoring, and coaching for purposeful and collaborative work environments. She is trained as a geophysicist, so holds a MSc of Physics from University of Rome and a PhD in Earth Sciences from University of Geneva, and she's a certified professional coach. And she is building on 30 years of project management, research, teaching, and mentoring experience at different locations in academia and in business. Lucia, looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Karin. So I will share my screen now. And please tell me if there is any problem, either in the audio or in the video. Okay. Oops.
You're not very loud. But...
yes, it's not the right one. I will move to this one. So I am really happy and excited to share with you the very preliminary results of a project which combines collective intelligence and artificial intelligence to investigate the competencies needed in the energy transition. And I will first give you the context of the ZEST project, Zero-Emission Skills for Transition. Then a very quick overview of the Mileva artificial intelligence system, and especially the key indicators that we will look to analyze the results, highlights of the main findings, and as we have seen, there is a lot of interest in carbon capture, so zoom in on the results about carbon capture, where in the geoscientist community we have heard about it for many years now. So let's see what Mileva has to say there. And a few considerations about black swans, weak signals, emotions. We'll conclude the presentation before the what's next step in the project. So for several years, we have been seeing in the press the challenges that the employment in the oil and gas and also higher education specific to oil and gas has encountered. On the other hand, we know that the competencies of the geoscientists are important to society. And so I've been asking myself, how can I and my professional network do something in this context? And my professional network includes the EAGE Local Chapter Paris, of course, and business partners who are expert in artificial intelligence to perform social economic analysis. So the idea is to provide perspectives on these topics using a new approach. And the vision of the project is, of course, in the context of the climate emergency. So what are the competencies needed in the geoscience community to contribute to the goal of limiting the rise of temperature to 1.5 degrees. And the final result for the geoscientists is to provide insights from different perspectives so that every geoscientist can be empowered to be actor of her or his own career path. And of course, the oil and gas sector has an important role to play in the decarbonization, and also the companies are well aware that skills and talents are needed to face these challenges. And so we started with an online survey between February 20th to April 30th to collect ideas, promote awareness, and stimulate discussion. There was no attempt to constitute a representative sample. We asked 8 questions, and 68 respondents completed the survey, and of which 63% came from the oil and gas sector. On the other hand, we used the Mileva Advanced Artificial Intelligence System, Mileva is a decision support tool, which has been used for actually over 10 years, providing complex analytics on areas of social, economic, or political interest. And we did run Mileva for ZES between April 10th and April 14th. So this was just before the negative oil price in the US due to COVID-19 lockdown. So dates are important there to see the results. And Mileva uses the principles of actor network theory to combine heterogeneous actors and especially make them interact. This theory was developed at the Center of Sociology of Innovation at Mines ParisTech by Michel Caillon and Bruno Latour. And in the next slides, we will see what we mean by heterogeneous actors. But before, I want to read a quote from Bruno Latour. Social does not designate a thing among other things, but a type of connection between things that are not themselves social. So you can recognize in the image elements, actors, which include emotions, environment, competencies, and in our context, we included also transport and refining in the oil and gas sector, and a series of actors grouped in risks and opportunities. And there are many more, as we will see. And what is important here is to think of the interactions between these actors. So what are common centers of interest between actors? So we gathered a panel of experts to define the context for this research. And the first thing we came up was actually competencies follow strategies. So the first question we should ask Mileva is maybe, what is the most likely strategy oil and gas companies will adopt to face the zero-emission challenge? And then we will think about the competencies. Of course, competencies are included in the model. So what we see here is a framework of 16 axes, grouping 153 actors. The number that you see beside each axis is the number of actors in each axis. So we have, of course, axes which include energy, oil and gas, competencies, economy and finance, strategies for oil and gas, and so on. And to define the actors in Mileva, you need to give a series of keywords, let's say about 10, but it can be a little bit less or even much more keywords, many more keywords. And we ended up with over 3,000 keywords for the 153 actors. Then Mileva started the run and extracted over 80,000 documents from the web. So the key indicators we will look in the outputs. Mileva, of course, gets a lot of tables and graphs, but we will have just look at a few of them. So the first indicator is the proximity index, which is, it tells you how many centers of interest are shared between actors. This index is expressed in percentages on a normalized relative scale between 0 and 100. 100% is, of course, the proximity index of an actor with itself. There is the communication emitted by each actor, and in particular relevancy and impact, and also the top converging actors, which is a kind of sort of popularity of an actor among the network. And here I'm using a common language to give explanation because it would take many hours to explain in a rigorous way all those things. Going back to the proximity index before moving to the next slide, I want to mention that we will look at the averages, because of course with 153 actors we have over 11,000 proximity index of an actor with all the other actors. Altogether they make over 11,000. But we will look first at the overall average of proximity index over the entire network, then a few consideration of proximity index average axis by axis, and then we will have a few slides where we will pinpoint proximity index between some specific actors. So what we found concerning the question, what is the most likely strategy oil and gas companies will adopt to face the zero emission challenge? The first result is quite surprising, because the overall interest of the network concerning this question is of only 43%. So the average proximity index over the entire network. Remember, the maximum can be 100%, so 43 is very moderate. And also the overall level of communication is quite modest, 51%. Then we have two actors of the access competencies which attract high consensus about the questions. So these are the popular actors. And we have geographic information system and visionary soft skills. Visionary soft skills give you a few keywords to grab what it means. We have a future-oriented, changing paradigm, and in general skills related to soft skills related to and useful for innovation. In terms of geographic information systems, it doesn't come as a surprise that this actor is popular. However, what is its strategic importance concerning the question? And in the panel of experts, there is a consensus that we got this popular actor because it's something which is used everywhere, but this is not going maybe to change anything concerning this, the asked question. And in fact, when we look at the impact of the communication of this actor, the impact is below 40%, so not very high. So let's have a look again at this mind map. Now that we know what the proximity index is, actually, if you consider the center of this map where there's the question, the axes are plotted in a way that is proportional to their average proximity index. So we find that indeed the axis, the actors in the axis oil and gas and the energy axis and 100 solutions, which include solutions to facilitate the zero emission challenge, they are taken by drawdown.org solutions. They are very close to the question, and they have a relatively high average proximity index, as competencies as well. Competencies include, we see that we have 18 actors. They include soft skills, but they include competencies specific to the geosciences, and also competencies, support competencies like finance, auditing, marketing, and sales, and so on. So we find all these axes are have higher average proximity index than the 43%. And what comes as a surprise is that the strategies for oil and gas are almost at the periphery of this network. So few hypotheses that we can emit here is that maybe the oil and gas sector is still reflecting about the course of actions to take in order to contribute to avoiding the to reaching the Paris target, or maybe remember the dates, the documents available on the web were not complete. In fact, we had, if I remember well, some announcement of a strategy by BP in February, last February, and the comments on the web, which I saw, is this document is more of a vision than a strategy. And also Shell did emit a strategy announcement, but it was on April 16th, and Mileva stopped running on April 14th. And so now if we go to look more in detail at these strategies for oil and gas companies, we took ideas on the actors to put there from a PricewaterhouseCoopers report on the oil and gas in 2019, and also some feedback from the survey, online survey. And so you have act on portfolio or on renewable energies, build vision on core know-how, and promote agility, full speed on fossil fuel alliances and consortia. And the other actors that you see on the slides are actors from the oil and gas axis, and also from competencies. And the particularities that each of these actors have a proximity index over 90% with one or another of the actors in the strategies for oil and gas. So for instance, transport and storage have a very high proximity index with act on portfolios. Then we have all on renewable energies has a very high proximity index over 90% with national oil companies and oil and gas regulators. And here just a little comment. It was unfortunate that we put together these two entities in the same actor. We will see later on how it is important to separate them. And just to be sure which one of these two elements has a high proximity index with all renewable energies. And it doesn't come as a surprise that exploration and production has a high proximity index with the build vision or core know-how, and also that data science and machine learning in the access competencies has a high proximity index with promote agility. We have seen that, we've read many reports in the press that these two things are linked. And now, as promised, a zoom in on carbon capture. Here we have we put carbon capture in the energy axis. And so what we have here on the left-hand side, we have the actors which have proximity index higher than 90% with carbon capture. And here I just want to drive your attention to the fact that either in the actor's name or in the axis of the actor, we have words like knowledge, competencies, knowledge again, knowledge, and in companies, there is a high proximity index with the consultancy major companies like McKinsey, Pricewaterhouse, and all these companies which make studies and very high-level analytics. So, and of course the majors, this also doesn't come as a surprise. There is high proximity index of the majors with the carbon capture. But what I want to state here is that maybe carbon capture seems to be a topic for specialists, okay? And this seems to be confirmed by the result to one of the questions we asked on the ZEST survey. We asked to rank 7 themes, all important for the energy transition, but we obliged participants to rank them in order of relevance. And you see in the black curve represents the consolidated answers from people coming from oil and gas and other sectors. And in blue, the responses from the oil and gas people, let's say, and in red, all the others. So everybody agrees about the first two themes, electricity generation, storage and distribution, and transportation. They rank top, first or first and second position. And in concerning the third and fourth position, there is just a swap between oil and gas and non-oil and gas, between land use and food, and materials management, saving and recycling. Where there is a difference is the carbon sequestration come at the last position from the people who not come from the oil and gas, while the oil and gas people put carbon sequestration at the 5th position. So it seems to confirm that in the context of specialists, carbon sequestration has more relevance than in general society, which seems to confirm also what we heard before. So now, black swans. So Mileva, what Mileva does, Mileva analyzes also weak signals emitted from the actors to estimate the probability of disruptive events, which are called black swans. And the black swan term was actually became popular around 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis. It was suggested as a term by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I think he was a trader, and it's an analogy to indicate an event which comes by surprise, which has a strong impact, let's say, on the environment, has huge consequences. And by looking after the event happened, one could rationalize and say, but there were actually some signals, which signals that if had they been taken into account, we may have forecasted what happened. And so here what you have is a table, a graph that Mileva outputs for black swan events for some of the actors with high probability. And just mention the first two. The very first one is national oil companies and oil and gas regulators. So you see here again how it is important to separate these two elements, and also social governance. So let's have a look at which weak signals are the national oil companies and oil and gas regulators ignoring. And we look in a table in Mileva, and we see that the actor is just private international law. And I leave it like that for concerning the black swan for these actors, and move to the weak signals over the entire network that we have seen before. We have here the 16 axis on the and the weak signals emitted in this graph. We can see that the strongest weak signals are come from the axis emotions. So what do we have in emotions? In emotion, we have four axes, four actors, sorry: opposition, resignation, excitement, and accomplishment. And you can see some of the keywords. In resignation, fear, sadness, discouragement; in opposition, anger, indignation, hate. And I let you read the others. What I want to point out here is that the segments which are ignoring the weak signals emitted by either resignation, excitement, or opposition are social governance and producer countries, and also US policy and economy think tanks. And there is also nice convergence between the artificial intelligence and the collective intelligence. We asked the participants of the survey if they agreed about a statement recognizing people's needs and motivational drivers while addressing negative emotions and leveraging on positive ones will be relevant in the context of the energy transition. And the large majority either agree or strongly agree with that, no matter if they came from oil and gas or other sectors. So what can we say after all this? It seems that the strategies we consider are at the periphery of the ongoing exchanges between actors concerning the energy transition. Carbon capture and storage seems to raise attention on mainly among specialists. Interested stakeholders maybe should communicate more effectively and broadly on the importance of carbon capture and storage to contribute to the zero emission goal. We have seen the importance of addressing emotions for social governance and social stability. And at this point, concerning the competencies, well, we have good news. In fact, competencies are important to implement strategies. They have a high average proximity index concerning the question. So we can say that competencies follows the strategy, yes. Competencies follow strategies. Competencies are important to implement strategies. And finally, we saw that data science and machine learning stand out to promote agility. And what's next in the ZEST project? Well, first of all, split these actors in two, national companies and oil and gas regulators. And of course, we will have to fine tune, simplify the framework. We may bring some changes to it. And we will have to ask questions about the competencies. Here, there is one question we could ask, but I invite you all, please, to write on the chat if you have suggestions, questions for Mileva, and please write the question you would see could be interesting to ask about competencies and the energy transition. These are the two fixed points, but then how to phrase it, I will be glad to collect all your suggestions. And then we will do a second run of Mileva. I want to thank, of course, the panel of experts which worked, people who worked with me, geoscientists from the EAGE Local Chapter Paris, an expert in finance with a strong background in oil and gas, of course, the LUSVAL team, and the specialist in artificial intelligence. So thank you very much for your attention. Here is share another convergence between artificial intelligence and collective intelligence with this word cloud, which collects the competencies identified by the respondents to the ZEST survey. And you see that they ring a bell with the visionary soft skills that we saw before. There is also the word agility, and that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucia, for sharing this quite diverse view on geoscience skills for the energy transition with us, or more on the strategies that energy companies, and particularly oil and gas companies, are embarking on. Perhaps to kick off a bit of discussion, could you clarify for the actors, the proximity indices, does it work in a way that Mileva searches in the documents for these keywords, and then the number of hits defines the proximity index to the question that you pose, or how is the proximity index calculated? And apologies if I missed that.
Well, no. There is a complex. Mileva uses deep learning and neural network. So there is this search webbing with search web with the keywords. But then for each, these documents are all put together for each actor. Let's say, to simplify that, all the documents for an actor are put together, and then they are analyzed in terms of entropy and information system, as Claude Shannon defined. And then for the interactions, it's even more complex. So first, there is the first step is information, and then the interaction between actors uses even more complex concepts.
So not as simple as I thought. Sorry for oversimplifying that. For another brief question, you highlighted that emotions were weak signals that may be overlooked despite their importance. And I also saw that society was actually quite far from the center. Do you see a relation by those two? Is kind of society and emotions in society both not taken sufficiently care of?
Well, this is yeah, it's a good question, and one I would have to look more in depth into that. I can make a guess. For instance, when we saw weak signals emitted, I think there were both resignation and anyway, there was resignation for the producer countries. What that can, maybe this can give some indication. And also in terms of social governance, we heard before also Mark's answers concerning the not having the CO2 in my back garden, and this kind of reactions. And when I say they should be taken into account, is well, first of all, maybe I don't know how, but the first step is to recognize that these emotions are there, and even for feel them, and then try to bring the dialogue to a higher level without disregarding the emotions, accepting them, but maybe being able, once the emotions have been accepted, to high grade the dialogue.
Further to that, we received a question: emotions are partly driven by modern media. Do you see a possible mitigation of this?
Don't start me on that. Yes. Well, I will give you my personal view also as a scientist. What I see that is often the word of the experts, and by experts I mean some scientists. We saw in the COVID-19 what we saw in the social media. I must say, it really upset me. I mean, there are, of course, the virus was not well known, but you know, experts have been used maybe to as the words of the experts have been used maybe by politicians, and we didn't hear the experts themselves. And there is a more there is a debate, ongoing debate in the scientific community also, of how the scientists are also citizens, and how they could put an effort in being more clear to when discussed with people, because otherwise things will get impossible to control, and we can assist to this phenomena of fake news.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
My
No, thanks again, Lousier. And this gives a perfect transition now to our last presentation by John. John, if you could take over sharing your screen. Because John is not only a geoscientist, he's also a trained social scientist. And in his presentations, he will try to integrate his experience from working as a geoscientist more than 33 years in the energy sector, mostly at the crossover of traditional and future energy sources. A number of degrees. I'm sorry that I can't really interpret them, so I will leave it to you to add whatever you see missing. But I should still mention he holds the position of an Honorary Research Associate at the British Geological Survey at the moment, and acts as a consultant geoscientist, engineer, and environmentalist. Please, John, over to you. Please feel free to fill the gaps that are left in your introduction, and looking forward to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Karin. As you know, I'm John. I started my career as a geoscientist in the oil and gas industry back in '87 after the '86 recession. Bounced around doing various things, most of it oil and gas exploration, got involved in CCS about 2002, thought it was an interesting thing, pushed at it, it became my full-time work in about 2008. I'm going to talk to you about skills for decarbonisation, skills for the future, what challenges geoscience faces, and what we can do, particularly as early career people, for the early career people, what kind of strategies you can use to adapt to the change that is certainly coming. As mentioned, I've got various degrees. The ones that give me some provenance to talk on this topic are the MSc in Earth and Environmental Sciences was one third a Master of Business. and the MA in education was looking at organisational learning and adult learning, communities of practice, how adults change to technological and social changes in the workplace. The postgrad diploma in sustainability leadership was with Cambridge University Institute of Sustainability Leadership. So that was looking at how businesses change to future events, and basically we're coming to the end of the growth scenario that gives us GDP, but I'll get onto that with the talk. So here I am. I'm going to talk to you about decarbonisation, skills for the future, how science and geoscience adapt. I hope you like the pictures. They represent different views of our world, from prehistory or early history through to what we've got today. One thing I'd like to point out is lots of people have new ideas. Not all ideas are correct. We're going to talk about a whistle-stop tour. The first half of the slides we'll go through fairly quickly. We'll look at labour, skills, what is a job. We'll look at the options that face us up to 2020 and post 2020. We'll look at adaptation or failure, and we'll look at ownership of careers, ownership of skills. So let's get started. We'll talk about work. Most people work without really understanding what the role of work is in society. I was once told work is something that you do that you wouldn't do unless you were receiving money for it, which I always thought was interesting in the context of geology, because I know lots of people that do it as a hobby, even as far as publishing peer-reviewed papers, and they don't get paid for it. Work is both a thing and an activity. So we use it as a noun. We have work, we do work, we get paid for work, but we can also use it as the verb. We can work on something. Work is very, very important to our lives. This is a representation of Maslow. A lot of you will be familiar with him. His theories have fallen out of fashion recently because they don't match up to our changing world. But for most of us, they are the basis of how our careers are formed and why we get up and go to work. So we've got the hierarchy of needs. It's broken down into 3 sections. You can change those section names. I mean, you can go from early career, mid-career, end career as a specialist. You could look at it as levels of earning different pay grades. You can look at it as promotion paths. Work also comes in different kinds. You've got academic and experiential, which I'll move on to later. But essentially, most people I'm talking to here, we are knowledge workers, we are skilled. So those of you that have read Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, he was looking then at the way to success was owning the means of production, that the workers owned the factories and they accessed and allocated the resources. It was a good theory for its time. It didn't really work. But when you think about our work as knowledge workers, we own our own means of production. That puts us in the driver's seat when it comes to having job, career, or profession. The basics of business, keep it simple. If you're employed by a business, that business has to make £1 or $1 or €1 more than you cost to employ. So if you think about the sector of work that you're in for the business or company you work for, if you're not in a profitable sector, the writing's on the wall. Turning points in work were essentially, it was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he brought about capitalization, which then led to neoliberalism and ultimately led to our global economies, which are the rules by which most businesses today work. They report their success as a business by growth, by market share, and by profit. So that's what dictates most of the way we work and why we have jobs, the jobs we have, and what we do in those jobs. If you want to learn more about that, there's a book by John Maynard Keynes called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. It's a bit dry, but it tells you essentially why you work. So what does work look like? here's some pictures from the past. These are all neoliberalists. These are all people working for companies. Some are doing labor, some are doing thought work. Some people, you have to ask yourself what they actually do. If you can understand what a geologist does. A geologist makes something from things in the earth. He contributes to everybody's everyday life. But then you think about a marketing executive. What does a marketing executive do? How do they actually add to society and add value and growth to that society? Why are we employed? How does a job, a career or profession work? So you start off with a company, you've got some skills that you put on your CV, you were asked about at the interview, you've passed the entry mark. When you're in the company in your early career, you're acquiring skills and you're improving those skills. In your mid-career, you learn complex skills and then you evolve to learn more complex skills. At the back end of your career, when you're at what we call management or a leadership position, you're creating new skills and you're expanding your influence within that company. You're helping direct the way it goes, the areas it works in, how it works in those areas. You're also controlling what people learn. The people that came after you, you're directing their endeavors. And what do these skills look like? Broadly, they come into two fields. There's academic, the ones that you acquire through research, the ones that you were taught, the ones that you learn from other people. And then you've got the experiential learning. This is usually for people that aren't academic, you know, whether you're an electrician, you do something, you're a plasterer, a builder, but also that can apply to geoscience. My first degree was done at a polytechnic in the United Kingdom, and polytechnics, they were proud of the fact that they were more experiential. They didn't expect to turn out students that went on to do PhDs and have an academic career. They were very focused on the people they turned out and learned trades and skills to use in industry. Up to 2020, we had a way of working that was called jobs for life. If you go back to before the Industrial Revolution, around about 1750, most people, they worked on the land, they were tied to that land, they'd worked on the land for generations. They may not own it, but they would have a parcel of land that they filmed, they grew crops, etc. So up to the First World War, even with the Industrial Revolution, we were still cottage industries. But up to the First World War, we were essentially what was called tied labour. And that was both tied geographically and tied to a single employer. People didn't really change jobs. Post First World War, when we had the great changes, the labour force became more mobile. People moved to jobs, and they would move countries, they would move towns, because they were chasing not the jobs that were available to them, but the jobs that they wanted to do. Post Second World War, because of the investment that went into designing technology in the war, organizations, workplaces became larger. You saw the start of General Motors, Imperial Chemicals Industries, and people generally wanted to work for large organizations. So this meant that they worked in a hierarchy, they were managed, and that's lasted through to today, although in today's world, that's very much under being challenged. So from the Second World War, we had the 40s, 50s to the 60s of a work progression. And then there's a thing in the 1960s called the Great Acceleration, where economies really took off. People were buying white goods, fridges, more ovens. People became richer. And with all this came opportunity. More people started to go into university. There was a shift from experiential learning to academic learning. This came to a halt in the mid-70s. The first one, which some of us may remember, was 1974 with the first oil crisis. That was the first of the big global recessions. We had more global recessions after that, with 1986, with 2008, and we're going to have one from 2020 onwards. But until then, until now, 2020, very much your employer determined your career path. So you join a company as a geoscientist or an engineer, they say, we want you to work on this, and then you'll progress onto that, and ultimately we want you doing this. And most people were happy for that, because the expectation was you joined a company and you stayed with it for life unless it was your choice to change. Well, as we know from the recessions, 74, 86 and onwards, you don't always get that choice. It's increasingly your employer not only determines your career path, but also tells you when you're not needed and tells you when you have to change. So this brings us to today, the challenges we face. We've got the economic challenges, which is, it's neoliberalist economics. It's predicated on continual growth. Well, given population growth and the fact we only have one planet, that will not work. Some of you might be familiar with Earth Overshoot Day. In 1969, that was the last year that the world used one year's worth of raw materials in 1 year. In 1970, it was mid-December that they were using a year's worth of raw materials. Today, we've already passed Earth Overshoot Day for this year. It was back in early May. So for 8 months of our year, we're living on borrowed resources. We're taking away what's called intergenerational equity from the generations yet to come. We're living on borrowed time. This has a feedback effect on both society and the institutions within those society, which are governments, businesses, and religious organizations. So what does that mean for us? It means we have to change because the world's changing around us. So as geoscientists, the idea of joining an oil company and having a 25-year career and a damn good pension at the end of it, those days have gone. It will not happen. About 10 years ago, when I was at BP, they stopped final salary pensions. They could see the writing on the wall. They could see they couldn't afford this kind of economic artifact. So what you usually get is, in the workplace, there are jobs, careers, and professions. As geoscientists, being degree educated, multiple degrees, we aspire to professions. So we don't have a job. A job is working in a shop. It's something that's relatively low skilled. It's something that doesn't require a lot of reflection on your part and rarely requires acquiring new skills. A career is chaining successive jobs together where you build on each job you've had. So one job automatically leads to the next job, which leads to the next job. You acquire some new skills. Rarely do you engage in any reflective practice. Where we are, where most of us are headed, is a profession. So we have a sequence of jobs, we build on them, we create new jobs out of what we know. We push things forward. But also as a professional, there are certain other things that separate us from people who have jobs and careers. We partake in communities of practice. We should engage in reflective practice and continued professional development. So that's up to 2020. Things aren't looking so good. Society and economies are changing. Why 2020 will be pivotal, be the pivot around which things move, is we were already headed to a recession, and the COVID-19 impact, that's going to accelerate a lot of the things that would have taken place over 10, 20 years. It will accelerate it to 3 to 5 years. So going forward, you will have one profession, multiple careers, probably with different employers, and quite possibly you will be working for free. The reason you'd work for free is because you need experience in a new sector and there won't be any jobs. So you start out working for free, you build up your experience, and then you start taking on paid work in a new area. You'd be looking at multiple employers. In the past, multiple employers meant I'm a geologist, I work for various geological firms. No, in the future, you'll end up working for a whole range of organisations. In the past 10 years, I've done work for governments, on economic change as a geologist. I've done work for Lloyd's Register looking at risk, project risk, as a geologist. So the skills that we have are readily adaptable to what skills are required in the future. It's just the environment in which we apply those skills will change. We also enter what's called the knowledge gig economy. That's somebody ringing you up saying, I'll pay you X amount to answer a few questions. I've had a couple of tastes of that. It's quite good. It's just a pain doing the paperwork to make sure the taxman gets his part. But most importantly, you now determine your career path, not your employer. This brings a lot of responsibility. You have to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, looking at what opportunities there might be in the future, but you get to choose what it is you want to do. The other challenges we've also got, decarbonisation as a business objective, that undermines neoliberalism. That's having a business that works to achieve something that is not profit. This is the challenge that carbon capture and storage has. It sits within companies that still work for profit. There is no profit in carbon storage, none at all. Even with putting a carbon price on it, it's got to be a very high carbon price. So things like carbon capture and storage will be done due to societal need, not because there's a profit in it. Which brings me to something called Zeitgeist. It's a German word. It captures the spirit of the age. And this is one of the key fulcrums around what change we've got in today's society, because a lot of people in society don't view profit as being the end result of work. It's about viewing work as creating a better, more equitable world, one where there's equal opportunities, where we don't always do things for profit, which again is something when you think of what's the most profit-oriented things in the world, it's generally tobacco, arms, and oil and gas. And there's a direct pivot away from that. There's a realistic prospect that a lot of oil companies, they're going to be left with stranded assets. People won't want that oil and gas. You know, you see people wanting electricity and they want that electricity to come from green sources. So that means that there's a demand there for energy, and it's one that people with geoscience skills can service. You're looking at heat storage in the underground, you're looking at geothermal, you're looking at high temperature drilling into volcanoes to get 950 degrees thermal out of it. So that's one of the things that the recessions haven't had to contend with to date. So we come out of this recession, given the fact that it's accelerated by the pandemic, the easiest way out of it is to leverage the assets that already exist. That means a step back from green alternative energies and going back to tried and trusted oil and gas, where the investment is already a sunk cost. If we want to progress with green energy going forward, it means a huge amount of money needs to be invested into infrastructure. We've seen everybody's economies taking a massive hit with COVID-19. That money's just not available from a government source. A lot of subsidies are going to have to be curtailed and reduced. So in the short term, green energy is going to take a bit of a hit. For oil and gas in the long term, oil and gas is never going to go away. We need oil and gas because we need it for industrial feedstock. You cannot make bleach without having ethane, and ethane, most of it comes from shale gas. You can't make fertilizers without hydrocarbons. So there's always going to be a demand for oil and gas. The question around that is, how profitable will that demand be? So meeting this challenge, it's all about adaptation. The key to adaptation is you don't do it suddenly. It's planned. It's something you start in advance, years before you need to change. Adaptation isn't always about change. People think, well, the job I had is gone, I need a new job. What I'd advise to people is, what skills have I got? Where can I reapply them? Which is called pivot. So as geoscientists, I think out of all the sciences you could do, you've got the best chance of doing a good pivot. Because when you look at a science degree, what you learn, you look at the areas we've already seen. If it's not grown, it requires a geologist. And even if it is grown, it needs fertilizers. So it still needs a geologist. We're good. We're geologists, geoscientists, geoengineers in a very, very good place to meet change. But to do that, you need to understand the work environment. You need to know the business you're working in. You need to know what its long-term plans are. So if you're working for a seismic company as a geophysicist, what's that seismic going to be? Are they just working on oil and gas? Are they working on geothermal? Are they looking for carbon capture and storage? If they're not, they should be. If you're managing your own career, you need to have a plan. And that plan has to include how you're going to upskill, keep your skills relevant, identify new skills. And most importantly, it's about when do you leave the job that you've probably gone? Are you going to wait until the economy dictates that your employer gives you your P45, tells you that you've no job come Monday? Or do you have an exit strategy? Under what circumstances do you leave that company voluntarily on your terms? So you've got a career. How do you manage it? There's a book I've highlighted there, Careers in Science and Engineering. It was a very popular book on Amazon, but I don't recommend it because it's looking backwards all the time. It's not looking forwards. So how do you own your own career? There's things you must do. Reflective practice, CPD, which is continued professional development. You need to know what your skills are. Look for a mentor and understand leadership. So reflective practice is very important. It's about understanding your role in the work you do, the role of the work in the company that you work for, the role of the company in the industry in which you're engaged. So it works on a variety of scales, personal, company, industry. But essentially, it comes down to the item in the middle, which is Kolb. That's Kolb's reflective practice circle. You see fancy ones like the one on the right, which is Gibbs. That was one that was done primarily for social sciences in the 80s. They just added a few more steps. But basically, it's the 4 steps of experiment with what you're doing, plan, try to do something, doing the job, which is they call having the experience, reflecting on how you did it, how well you did it, what have you learned from that experience, and most importantly, how does that impact when you do that thing again? So when you'll hear people talk about reflective practice, it's nothing mystical. It's a simple 4-step process. Most of us do it every day without thinking. But being a professional means that you have to formalize these things, move them from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, and plan. The other thing that's essential when owning your own career and learning to do things differently is about continued professional development. A lot of people complain to me that CPD is boring and that it only benefits the company you work for. That's not true. Well, the boring bit, it can be boring. You could be stuck listening to me. The good thing about the company supporting you in doing it is the company pays for it. This includes formal training and informal training. But what it really means to you is these are the skills that you develop in your present job that will get you your next job. It will get you your next pay rise. It will get you your next promotion. The best way to do it is join a learned society. I'm in the Geological Society. I'm a chartered geologist, fellow of the Geological Society, and a requirement of being chartered is that you keep your CPD up to date. You have a record that is audited and you prove that you're keeping your skills relevant and you're meeting the needs of society in general. So I can't stress the importance of CPD enough. If you're not doing it now, you should really start. Best way to start is with a work diary. Write down the projects you're on, what your thoughts are about them, how you can add extra value. Other tasks you should undertake to manage your career and meet challenges is a skills audit. I've got a square there. Some call it a Boston square, a box. I just call it a square. You make a list of the skills you have. the skills that you and your peers have, which are usually what you had to have to get the job. So these are the things that regularly appear on your CV. Have a look round. What skills do your peers have, the people you work with, that you do not? But most importantly, speak with your managers. What skills do your company need that aren't present there already? And prioritize acquiring those skills. That makes you a valued worker. It usually leads to promotions. It gives you more control over your career, but it also makes you more employable, not just to your present employer, but to other employers in the market space. This is what a skills audit, skills map looks like. It's a simple spreadsheet. This is an example of what I use, although I've not updated mine in 10 years. The important things here is to prioritize what you're aiming to learn, and then what you have of evidence of competency. The best things to have are certificates where you've sat an exam and received a mark. That's the gold standard of CPD. In-house, industry, even things you do with contractors, get things certified, get them examined. Other things are spending time in a webinar like this. You know, you're learning something, it's informal, it's not examined, but it will still count as points towards CPD.
John, I don't know how far you are. To allow us a few minutes for questions, if you could slowly wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah, I've 2 or 3 slides left, very quickly. Find a mentor. This is somebody that you respect in your company, somebody that has made mistakes that you might learn from. They'll help you to develop professional practice. And if you ask them, they'll explain the mistakes you've made. And they can also give you some direction with CPD. The last task, but not least, is leadership. People confuse leadership in companies with management. They are 2 separate things. Anybody in a company at any level can be a leader. It just depends about context. So there's 3 leadership statements there. They're just ones I hold out. I'm not saying they're right, I'm not saying they're wrong, but they're there for you to reflect on and give some thought to, by doing these things or not doing these things, how will it influence your career? And that then brings me to the end. So the takeaways are the bullet points, and I'm now open to questions. Yeah,
thanks a lot, John, for this very practical and hands-on advice, and also for providing us with a larger context on work from a social science point of view. I learned quite a bit through that. I have a few questions for you. First, could you please tell us a bit more how you transited to the different roles in your own career and how you gained the necessary skills?
I have to be honest, I never had a career plan. This is why I take it so seriously now, because had I had a career plan at the start, I could have gone a lot further, I'm sure of it. With me, I get bored easily, and people used to offer me strange or dangerous things to do, dangerous places to work. And sometimes, because I worked internationally in the oil industry, sometimes I'd take a job because it was a place I'd always wanted to visit, or because it was an exciting place to be at that time, or because there was additional training with it. I spent a lot of time in Algeria, and to work down there, I trained as a paramedic and a fireman, which I wouldn't have had that opportunity in most of the places.
Good. I'm still unmuted. Further to that, John, great presentation. I appreciated your holistic view and practical approach. My question, what is the main misunderstanding about energy transition between geoscientists at the moment?
It depends what model you go adhere to, whether it's business as usual or everything needs to change. A lot of the people I've worked with in big oil companies, BP, Equinor, Shell, they see it as business as usual, that decarbonisation is just another step in our business model. We will be your energy provider. It's just how the energy is generated, whether it's generated from conventional oil and gas or it comes from solar cells or geothermal, is irrelevant. We will provide you with energy. When I was with BP 10, 12 years ago, they were the biggest supplier of wind power in the United States. But they were predominantly, they were an oil and gas company. So oil and gas companies, a lot of them view decarbonisation as the next logical step in business. Other geoscientists, they have a different view. They see it through a social need perspective, that we need to reduce carbon, we need to do things for society, and it's just good practice to move away from polluting oil and gas. The end game is the same, but the rationale for action, for movement, is very, very different.
And there are two questions to the mentor task. First, is the mentor task the way to have a long career? And do you think it's good to have a mentor from outside your current organization, in addition to or instead of inside your current organization?
That's a good question. A mentor is just somebody who's further along in their career than you. The further they are along in their careers, the assumption is the better the advice they can give. I always thought the best mentor to have is somebody who works for a company that you would want to work for. You may not immediately get access to that. That's why it's so important to be part of a community of practice. So maybe through the EAGE or the Geological Society, you can find a mentor who works for a company that you admire. If you're just wanting to learn the nuts and bolts, then yes, find a mentor in the same company.
And perhaps a final question. How did you go about making the list of developments you chose for yourself? And how would I make the list for myself? What is your recommendation how to approach that?
Oh, I had a good career in oil and gas. And this was in the days when it was oil and gas that was pollution, that was going into countries where you kept, it was to your advantage to have an oppressive regime in place. And I saw all the gender inequalities, the opportunity inequalities, and just the bad things that the oil industry did. So that made me then question what I wanted to get out of life. And I made a list of the things I needed to do to use my skills in the service of society rather than exploiting society. And that's how I came up with my first list and started making the change.
So kind of the advice is think of what you really want to do and achieve in your life, and let your developments be guided by that.
I mean, you've already got yourself a geology or engineering degree, so that's the skill set you've got. It's how you want to use those skills. Look how you want to use them, and then work backwards from that. How do I put myself in a place where I can use them the way I want to use them, rather than doing what I did, which was, wow, that job pays a lot, I'll do that.
Thanks. Definitely gives a more clear direction to your career path, and considering the changes ahead, it's probably good to have a strategy indeed. Sorry that we have been running a bit over time with the presentation, so that there's no time left for a general discussion, but I think we answered quite a few questions directly after the talk, so I hope you are not disappointed. And I would have one last request before closing this call. Could you all briefly switch on your video, that we can take just a screenshot, a final photo of all the participants in the virtual space. If I find my button.
Lucia,
okay.
You have to open my video because I cannot. You did it. So now I'm prisoner. I'm in jail with Lucia.
Good. So once. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining our after work today. Thanks particularly to the three speakers, to Max, to Lucia, and to John for sharing their views on the topic. And I hope to see many of you back at part 2 about talents and competences in the energy sector. Someone to come in. Good evening or good day to the people in Brazil who are just about to start it. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Jean-Jacques, you have
Yes.
to turn on.
Bye.
Oh, okay, fine.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ah, hey, thank you.